All right, everyone. So I am known as that pronatalist guy, or as the media has brandished me. I love that people think I chose this title for myself. I'm like, I don't choose the headlines that are written in antagonistic media pieces. The elite couple breeding to save mankind, for having the audacity to point out that it's probably a big problem how quickly fertility rates are falling. And I want to, in this talk, both cover how big a deal it is, why it matters politically in terms of the political alignment of the country and where the country is going to be in the future, and potentially even the future economic system of the world, which I think is going to be radically different than the economic system today because of fertility rates. And, well, I'll just get into it. So in America right now, if the fertility rate keeps falling at the rate it has for the past 10 or so years, and if we have one generation every 30 years, for every 100 Americans, there's going to be 4.3 great-grandchildren. Now, people hear that and they're like, okay. I understand if it keeps falling, but certainly it's going to stop falling after a while, right? The problem is that we have the good fortune in America of being one of the furthest behind wealthy countries on the fertility collapse spectrum. So we can look at countries that are 10, 20 years ahead of us on this collapse and see if their numbers declined over time, like if the fertility collapse lessened or if it sped up over time. So you could look at a country like Korea, where even with its current fertility rate, doesn't need to keep falling. For every 100 Koreans, there's going to be around 6 great-grandchildren. Well, they fell 11.5% year over year this last year. And they have spent $200 billion trying to fix this in the last 16 years. And this is very fortunate. And I always love when reality overlaps with libertarian policy proposals, because it could be the case that maybe handing out money to parents actually helped fertility rates. And if that was the case, I would be in a tricky situation with my natural inclinations and running the movement. But this graph is probably one of the most important graphs to know in the fertility space. So what it shows is studies where as the line goes up, the study is more likely to say that cash incentives increase fertility rate. Now, you might notice the margin of error on these studies has a shocking correlation with how likely the study is to say that giving out cash handouts helps fertility rates, which and when you get to the ones that have basically no margin of error, they almost all say it does nothing. Hungary spent 5% of its GDP trying to fix this problem a year ago. They got their fertility rate up by 1.6%. Keep in mind, it's falling by double digits in dozens of countries around the world right now. And this is even true in countries you wouldn't expect. I would ask the person to go to the next thing here, but the other thing here is on Latin American fertility rates. If you're open to just clicking the other button, anyone, the other tab here. But there was a UN Populations Division study on Latin America in 2019. It's just the other tab there that's on Latin American fertility rates. And they came, there we go, yeah. This article, I'd suggest, if anything I'm saying here sounds preposterous to you, check this out, check out the validity of this source, because a lot of people are not updating fertility numbers with how bad things have gotten. So you really need articles like this that interview local demographers, because the numbers have been, as one demographer called it, vertiginous, meaning it's basically gone vertical in the last few years. One was saying that, for example, in Argentina, there's going to be 40% fewer students in first grade classes in just a few years than there would have been something like 5 years ago. In Latin America, in 2019, the UN Populations Division surveyed the country, and they said in the second half of this century, the fertility rate will stabilize, i.e. stop falling, at around 1.75. Every single of the major countries that they were looking at has gone below that number in less than 5 years, except for one, which was Mexico. In fact, a number of the countries they were looking at, Uruguay, Argentina, Jamaica, Cuba, and I think that's it, but that's a lot, have gone below the 1.3 number. That means they're basically halving in population every year. I can almost guarantee you that within a decade, the average fertility rate of Latin America is going to be lower than the average fertility rate of the United States. And this is a big problem for people who want to solve fertility collapse with immigration. So If this is such a big issue, and I don't want to get into all the economics of this issue, I'm sure everyone here knows that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme and that we're in for a world of hurt as this begins to play out. But outside of that, why can the media not talk about this? Why does it have to tar and feather my wife and I when we bring up that this is a major geopolitical issue? Why are you not hearing these statistics? It's because, unfortunately, our society is built on a bit of a shell game, which is that we can have high amounts of prosperity, and we can have high amounts of gender equality, and we can have higher amounts of education, and we can have this urban monoculture, this progressive culture dominate society, and we can have wealth, and we can export this. But it turns out the only reason that this system is able to maintain wealth is like a shell game. They keep the population high by bringing in people from countries that don't have these things yet. And even this system is beginning to break down as the developing world begins to collapse in population. Now, this becomes a critical issue when you consider the fact that the cultural groups which rule our society right now, what we call the urban monoculture in a lot of our writings, are incredibly low fertility. They can only maintain their economic, social, and political power through converting people from nearby, mostly children, because that's when people generally deconvert between the ages of 15 to 21, from nearby high fertility cultural groups, or by importing people from nearby cultural groups. Now, this creates an existential issue. People do not like having their children converted, especially when that conversion leads to those children believing that they hate their parents, that their parents abuse them, and that, I just need to distance myself with everything my birth culture stood for. And then when the converting group can't stop. And again, this is not like malevolent. No one is out there saying we need to convert children to stay in power. What's happening is within this very low fertility group, and you can look at major US cities right now, you're looking at a fertility rate of like 0.7 or so. The iterations of that cultural group, which said other people's children are off limits, we need to respect other cultural systems, they didn't convert people, and thus they exist at a lower population threshold. The iterations who said it is our sort of a manifest destiny to convert as many children as possible, and that this is our duty to do this, they exist in higher numbers. It's simple cultural evolution. It's nothing malevolent is going, well, I mean, it's malevolent in what it leads to, but it's not malevolent in its action or in its design. And then the iterations of this culture that are more effective and the tools that it uses that are more effective at converting kids end up becoming more and more large and more dominant. This creates, from a libertarian perspective, huge and existential problems in our society, because it means that the economic power centers in our society, the media power centers, and the educational power centers are all dominated by one cultural group that can only survive by using those power centers to convert children from nearby demographically healthy cultural groups. Now, some people might say, the urban monoculture, why are you calling this? Like, why are you acting like everyone in cities is part of one big, large cultural group? And this is an accurate point. People will identify with different cultures when they're within the urban monoculture because it functions very differently than cultures did historically. So historically speaking, most cultures were also religions. You'd say, I am Catholic, or I am Protestant, or I am Jewish, or I am Muslim, and then you have your subcultural group within that, right? But you would identify first and foremost as your cultural system. And then when your cultural system was invaded, like when somebody moved into your cultural system from an external cultural system, the typical reaction of most of these cultural systems was to like burn this person as a heretic. And this historically was the way that most things worked. Well, the urban monoculture developed a number of very unique mechanisms that have never been used in a historic context. So the first is it doesn't burn its heretics. That would galvanizes resistance. It does something which we call sort of shadow banning. If you can think of cultural groups as sort of overlapping nodes of interconnected individuals, it begins to de-emphasize all of the connections to any nodal unit that looks immune to its cultural practices. Now, this might seem like a lot, so I'll describe this in practice. It means that within a company, if it has set up a tumor, so we would call like a DEI department or something like that a tumor of the urban monoculture. It is a transmissible tumor. Like in dogs, you can get transmissible canine venereal tumors. Sometime thousands of years ago, a dog developed a tumor that just happened to be transmissible to other organizations, or other dogs. And the same thing happened with the urban monoculture with DEI departments. These are departments that exist within an organization, and like a tumor, they tell your body, I'm super important. You really need me. Without me, racism will start to spread. Well, this is what tumors do. They signal to your body, I'm doing something super important, but I need all of the blood you can give me. This is why with tumors, you get more and more blood around them. And what are these departments doing? They're putting out surveys, they're putting out classes, all of which are designed to convert people to the urban monoculture's practice. When they spot an immune node, a node that doesn't go along with what they're saying, they begin to shadow ban. People are afraid of cancellation, but that's not the real threat. They basically make it so that this person doesn't get promoted as frequently. Other people become afraid to talk to them. Other people become afraid to communicate with them. And as things go further, as an infection goes further, what is considered an immune node, what is considered heresy, becomes smaller and smaller in fractions over time. So I was talking about this as a monoculture, and another thing that makes it really different than cultures in a historic context. As I said, historically, you would identify with your culture. I am X denomination of a religion. It says you don't need to do that. You can still identify with whatever your birth religion is, and you can still celebrate those holidays. But you need to agree with us on pretty much every single moral position possible. You need to agree with us on sexuality. You need to agree with us with what marriage is like, the way a person should date. You need to have broadly the same cosmology as us. You need to have the same beliefs as us around the way we relate to our environment. You need to have the same beliefs as us around morality, good and evil. And when I talk to, like if I'm asking a progressive Catholic or a progressive Muslim or a progressive Jew about any of those subjects, they're going to have broadly the same answers. But if I ask conservatives of those three faiths the same questions, they're going to have entirely different answers, whether it's about cosmology or sexuality or our relationship to the environment. And this is leading to a situation where politics in this country, and I believe around the world, are beginning to sort into two core groups. One group is the urban monoculture and individuals who align with this group, and they broadly are based on facilitating it converting people into it, specifically during the age of most conversion, which I mentioned earlier here, but a lot of people weren't here yet, which was between 15 and 21. It targets your kids not because it's like evil, but just because that's when most people deconvert. So it's useful to target people of that age range, and the iterations that focused on targeting that age range outcompeted the iterations that didn't. Oh, sorry, where was I? I was talking about cosmology. Yes. Where it's playing out politically. So this is going to lead to a situation where you have one political faction around the world which aligns with the goals of the urban monoculture, which is largely around global unity and putting the entire global ecosystem and global power system under one hierarchy, which is ruled under this sort of cultural ecosystem. And then this hierarchy will distribute this cultural ecosystem all around the world through aid organizations and everything like that. And then opposed to that is a broad and diverse collection of either historic and older cultural systems, which typically look like conservative religious traditions, or other deviant cultural systems like weirdos, where weirdo is defined by how culturally different you are from the dominant culture in your society. And I mean, it's totally just that they define weird that way. Of course, weird is how differentiated you are from the dominant cultural group. But unfortunately, when the dominant cultural group is so low fertility, being weird is also what protects your fertility rate. This is, Elon Musk, for example, not a particularly religious individual, but certainly not a fan of the urban monoculture, and they are not a fan of his. And so individuals like him, who historically would have been hard aligned with the dominant cultural faction in society or like far leftist ideology, now they're all consolidating in this, we just want to preserve our traditions and preserve humanity into the future, which requires this decentralized architecture, which is really now this is all very useful from a libertarian perspective, because what it means is, politically speaking, if you look at the old conservative party in this country, it was predominantly about imposing the dominant cultural system, which was a Christian belief system, in broad terms, a Protestant WASP Christian belief system. This is back when Catholics were still considered evil and everything like that, on the country as much as possible. But that has drifted over time. And now the number one conservative influencer in the world 2 years ago, I think last year as well, was Andrew Tate. And when he converted to Islam, broadly speaking, most conservative influencers were happy about that. Well, this marks a sea change in sort of the, and then keep in mind, I'm talking like Gen Alpha, Gen X, like we're talking about the younger conservative influencers. This marks a sea change in opportunity for libertarians because it means that now the Conservative Party is moving to be the party of diversity at an existential level. And if it doesn't embrace this, it loses because all of the traditionalist religious systems are minorities now. And where they're not minorities, they're losing. So let me explain what I mean by this. The average Catholic majority country in Europe right now has a fertility rate of only 1.3. In fact, a great study by Arya Babu showed that while within a country, the more conservative an individual was, the higher their fertility rate was. Between countries, on average, the more conservative, at least in Europe, a country was, the lower its fertility rate was. And this is because part of what maintains a high fertility rate is knowledge that you and people like you are different from the people around you. This is part of why the only high wealth country in the world that has been able to maintain a high fertility rate is Israel. Because you look at Israel and it's very obvious, they're very different from the people around them. Where if you look at the countries where when you control for the wealth of a country seem to have unusually low fertility rates, they generally fall into two categories. Either they are uniquely homogenous, countries like Korea or Japan or China, where it's homogenous by region at least, or they have a uniquely low amount of hope for the future. We can get to that in a second. But you look for uniquely high fertility countries like the United States and Israel. Things that you will notice about them, uniquely high fertility for their wealth, is they're typically more religious and more diverse than other countries. Diverse in cultural practices within a country, which means, anyway, so let's get to the hope thing, because this is actually really interesting. If you look around, because something that's really interesting to me as somebody who studies this is, has anyone ever persistently reversed a fertility decline? And the true answer is no, not meaningfully, not for more than like 4 years. But there is a place where it was reversed for like 4 years, and this was Georgia. And so a lot of people will look at this and they'll say, oh, this is when the Patriarch of Georgia started blessing the babies of new parents. And I looked and I believed this for a while. I was like, oh, this must be it, you know, my religious thesis here. But then I looked closer and I was like, did any special events happen the year the fertility collapse switched around? And I looked around and it was something called the Rose Revolution, which is when they kicked out the last of the communists from their country in terms of governing positions of power. And then you saw a persistent change in fertility rate. If you look around the world and you see these low fertility rates despite, you know, wealth indicating that it should be higher, like in China, it's because in China, when the government goes to somebody and says, I want you to have a kid, that person is thinking, you want me to have a kid so you can maintain the elite's economic power. This kid doesn't actually have any social mobility. This kid is just being used by you to maintain the power and ecosystem that you have built for yourself. Whereas in Israel, when somebody says you should have a kid, everyone's like, oh yeah, I get it. We're doing it for our community. We're doing it for our people. And this is why, if you look at our book out there, The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion. The Pragmatist Guide to Governance, everyone has. It's not really on this topic. It's another book that we wrote, but it did top the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, so that's exciting. But The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, you can pick it up if you want. It's that big honker of a book. And a lot of people say, why is your fertility rate book on religion? Like, it seems weird to a lot of people. Why is it like an anthropology of how the current religious ecosystem came to be, how wokeism evolved, and how religions work at the most technical of level? And here I mean technical. Like, we're looking at things like how many people deconvert per generation, how do different practices relate to that, how defensible does that make them vis-a-vis other nearby cultural groups? Well, it matters because of the first graph I showed you, which showed cash handouts don't work. If cash handouts don't work, and the core, and I think this is intuitive to everyone within a society, the core thing that differentiates groups is culture in terms of fertility rate, then the core path forward is either to protect high fertility religions and give them the tools to protect themselves, or build new ones. And this doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a full religious religion, like we think religion historically. But it needs to be different enough from the urban monoculture that people are going to call you a religion. Like, for my kids, we have like unique holidays for them and stuff like that. Like, we've created our own little family system for them. And people are like, that's really weird. Why would you do that? And it's because I want them to know when they go to school and people come to them with weird ideas, that these people, they shouldn't look upon them with enmity, but they should see them as basically a different religious group. Because if you teach them that the schools are filled with evil people or evil groups, and then they get to know one of those groups, and they're like, hey, this person isn't evil. They're nice to me. They're kind. They seem to care about other people. Well, now they've undermined all of your teachings around that, which makes it very easy for them to be deconverted. But if you teach them, oh, the schools are just a different religious ecosystem, we live alongside them, but be aware that like a cult, in the same way that like when I see a Hare Krishna walking towards me, I walk to the other side of the street. No animosity there. I just don't want to pick up that little thing they're handing me. They know to expect these interactions in their school environments and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm open to questions now, and I hope I didn't ramble too long. Yes?
What fertility rate is break even?
2.1 is break even in the world today. For example, Latin America fell below 2.1 on average all the way back in 2019. It's like, yeah, we're at like 1.5, 1.6 or something, I think, in the United States. I think we're at 1.6 here. China's at like 1.1. Yeah. Korea's at like 0.7, 0.8. Yep.
I wonder if you're discounting the pure religiosity thesis just a little bit, because from my understanding, church-going, for example, correlates highly with fertility, not just at the individual level, but also at the aggregate level. And so those Catholic majority countries in Europe, actually no one goes to church there, no one's actually very religious, they're kind of nominally Catholic.
Yeah.
They effectively deconverted because maybe because they lack that religious pluralism, and where you do have lots of religious competition, maybe religions are more productive in a sense.
I agree very strongly. This is a core thesis in our book, that mono-religious countries lead to the religion degrading really quickly. We sort of liken it to living life in a mech suit, where your muscles eventually atrophy because you don't need to actually exercise mental control to engage in the religious prohibitions and everything like that, and you aren't seeing constantly how you're different from the people around you, which is really interesting. I mean, it's a good point, and it's something that Catholics, for example, should be asking themselves. Why are Catholic communities stronger in countries where they're not the majority? Like, this is an excess, and then, does that mean that they should strive to exist more in countries where they're not the majority? Would they do better if they're living in a country where they're majority, immigrating to a country where they're not the majority? Anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm.
This appears to be something which is coded biologically very deep into the human being, because if you're not to maintain the population within your culture, you will actually reproduce at a higher rate if there's an exponential threat. And this dovetails with what the gentleman just brought up. The threat, being the religious minority within a culture, is a perceived threat, and not necessarily, a not real one.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you had looked into that.
It is, yes. So there's a great study on this. It was done with tsunamis, because you can't easily control for war, but you can not control where a tsunami hits, but tsunamis hit at random, right? So I can look at one town that was hit by a tsunami, and then a town that's broadly, culturally, and economically equivalent that wasn't hit by a tsunami. Fertility rates explode after tsunamis. So you're right. When people experience themselves as being in unique positions of hardship, fertility rates shoot up, and when they experience themselves as being in unique positions of gluttony or hedonism, fertility rates collapse. And we see this historically as well. I mean, there's a famous thing with Augustus complaining about the Roman elite's fertility rates collapsing. And by the way, anyone who wants to read our book on this, it's called The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, whenever you want. It's free. We got way too many of them here, and I really need to get rid of them all. Anyway, yeah, did you have a
Well, there's some other things which are maybe sort of comment. You brought up Israel as having a high replacement rate. And you're taking a look at
They're at 3.1, yeah. Yeah, so obviously Haredi are the dominant fertility faction within Israel, but even secular Jews within Israel have an above replacement fertility rate, which is kind of shocking for statistics. Now, of course, they will become a smaller faction over time because the Haredi are having more kids than them, but it is worth noting, yeah. Sorry, to the person in the back who had a question, yeah.
So you went awfully quickly through the argument that immigration is a solution to the fertility collapse in the U.S.
Okay, hold on. I could talk about this for a while and get a little spicy.
What I sort of thought was that, and from what you presented, is that Latin Americans or Africans coming to the U.S. could replace the Americans not being born, and that might be a problem for their home countries, but it would solve the fertility collapse in the U.S., and particularly if they settled in rural areas, those people who are not primarily from your urban monoculture would be deconverted to conservative values or something.
Yeah.
So why is immigration not the solution?
Well, so within Latin America, as I was saying, I think that they'll be below us in average fertility rate within a decade. It's like a farmer who's draining from his neighbor's pond to fix his his irrigation issue. And you point this out to him and he goes, well, what? It's from the neighbor's pond. And you're like, yeah, but that pond is dehydrated. Like, it's disappearing rapidly. What are you doing? And he goes, it's not my pond. I don't care. And you're like, you know this runs out, right? But it creates a bigger problem and a more existential and optical problem, which is fertility rates actually do stay high when the average person in a country is earning under 5,000 USD per year, which we do have in a number of African countries. Now, and this is the going societal solution right now, we will solve this by importing people, this creates an existential optical problem. We are essentially importing people from Africa to support non-working white elderly people who didn't put in the effort to raise their own kids. Like, optically, importing people from Africa to support non-working white people should be an issue. It shouldn't be the quote-unquote not racist strategy. And it should be an especially big issue when it creates an economic incentive that the United States and Europe prevent these African countries from ever developing, from ever leaving this state of existential poverty, because they're using them like a human farm. And I remember I said this to a reporter once, and he goes, are you really suggesting that the CIA would conspire to damage the economies of developing countries? And I remember I was thinking, I was like, I want to live in your fantasy world, my friend. That is exactly the situation that we are setting up for the world if we create that. And so it's not that it couldn't work. We can basically turn countries into human farms if we want to, by sabotaging their economies and then taking immigrants from them. It will intergenerationally have a really negative effect on these countries as we begin to siphon a larger and larger portion of the population, because that means with every generation we're taking the best and brightest. You do that for like 3 or 4 generations, the damage you are going to cause to an economy is catastrophic. Which brings me to techno-feudalism, which I guess I'll end the talk with, but I want to answer a few more questions.
I know historically when there's a war or other disaster, fertility has gone up. Is that still true actually with ready availability of modern contraception? I'm a little surprised if it is.
Well, the Latin American fertility collapse started like 3-4 years ago, and the tsunami study was done like 10 years ago, so I don't know. To the very back. Yeah.
Okay. Another reason why it doesn't work is you have the same thing going on in Canada along from. And raising your birth rate over time gradually by, the normal way is a lot different than bringing in people really fast from wherever you're bringing them from. It will bring a major strain on all of your aspects of your society, your healthcare, your housing, all your infrastructure. So growing over decades versus growing over years.
Yeah. Well, I want to end with 2 things that I sort of forgot to talk about. One is the core goal of the pronatalist. I'll get to you at the end if I have time. Okay, so the core goal of the Pronatalist Foundation these days, a lot of people are surprised by our core project, which is to create an educational system that can compete with the mainstream educational system. And people say, why are you doing this? And I go, because that is the primary enemy of cultural pluralism within this country. If I can create a true neutral educational system that doesn't attempt to deconvert people, and they're like, you really think you can outcompete the existing educational system? And I'm like, are you asking, like, could I beat up a toddler? Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be sad and bloody, but yeah, I mean, if the toddler is an existential threat to me, I can probably beat him up. But this also, I also want to talk like, more existential here. And to learn about that project, you can check out collinsinstitute.org. We'll likely be launching this year. I'm really excited about it. The other thing I want to talk about is what this means for the future of economics. Because we have a lot of people here in the crypto space and stuff like that. And in a world with rapid falling fertility rates, where those fertility rates are specifically falling in the group that are the most culturally productive at an economic level, this changes the entire global economic system. A lot of people ask me, they go, oh, you aren't concerned about like the high fertility in Africa, right? Like, did that matter? And I go, no, definitionally high fertility in a country where the average citizen is earning under 5,000 USD per year does not matter to the global economy. But if you're talking about low fertility in the economically productive areas of the world, this actually does matter, very existentially, because historically speaking, the reason why gold has value, the reason why land has value, the reason why Bitcoin has value is because these are divisible things with a fixed value in the world. And in a world where productivity is increasing and the number of humans is increasing, anything with a fixed value is going to increase in value over time. Population has been exploding exponentially over the past however long, so those things have been increasing in value exponentially over the past, basically, human history. When that stops, the entire economic model of our society turns on its head. Stuff stops being the core thing of value, and human capital becomes the core thing of value. Productive human capital. So not all humans, and this gets even more wonky with AI, because AI makes probably about the bottom 50% of humans in terms of economic productivity irrelevant. Maybe more, maybe the bottom 80%. Well, this becomes really, I don't want to say problematic, but on an economic world stage, what happens? Well, what we're sort of looking at happening, like when I try to plot out what's going to happen here, countries are going to become more and more ultra progressive over time as the urban monoculture becomes more and more desperate to maintain its hold, differentially lowering the fertility rate of the high economically productive groups within those societies, but also raising things like taxes and controls on things like freedom of speech, which is going to push the economically productive people out of those countries. If charter cities are able to establish themselves successfully, it's going to push those people either to places like New Hampshire, which is useful only insofar as the US government doesn't become more totalitarian, which good luck, or to charter cities in other regions. And people might be like, but why would they go to charter cities? They don't have minerals, they don't have factories. But in a world where the core commodity is productive human capital, you don't need that stuff. This changes the entire economic system of the world pretty dramatically. And we're already beginning to see old world thinking versus new world thinking. Where this really hit me is when I was working in Korea, and I was considering the fact, I said, 6 Koreans for every 100 Koreans alive today in 100 years. And I was like, who's gonna fill all these buildings? I was like, Japanese could come, but no, they have a low fertility rate. Chinese could come, but no, they have a low fertility rate. And then it was wild for me to consider that less than a century ago, the Japanese, in the effort to expand their cultural footprint, were able to motivate their population to go out and kill millions of people to try and expand it, but they can't motivate their population to have sex. Reproductive sex at least. And then I look at something like what's going on in the war in the Ukraine right now. Like, these are two very similar cultural groups with very low fertility rates, basically genociding their own populations. There's no way they come back from this. They have a fertility rate of 1.1, 1.2, right? Capturing land means nothing in this world future system. So this is really interesting that historically you could win by going out there and trying to impose your values martially or expansionistically on other people. Where today, the only way that you win, the only way your cultural values survive to the next generation is you build cultural traditions which are more loving than your neighbor. And by that, what I mean is I don't mean loving in a just spam children way, but you need to be able to have 8 children that liked their childhood enough. As my wife always says, your first 18 years are your chance to pitch your culture to your kids. If they don't want to replicate it after that 18 years, it probably shouldn't be replicated. It's your chance to pitch that culture to them, and if you do a good job, then they replicate it. And we are in this great age of cultural experimentation now, where new cultures are being tried and old cultures are being augmented to come up with better defenses against the urban monoculture. And what the pronatalist movement fundamentally is a beacon for all of these different groups who are okay with living in a pluralistic world to band together against the core other group that's going to come out of fertility collapse. Because eventually the urban monoculture collapses. And there's another strategy to getting through fertility collapse which works really, really well and is really, really scary. It is intense technophobia, intensely being economically unproductive, basically to the extent where you are almost living like you're in a pre-industrial country, and intense xenophobia, which prevents you from hearing outside ideas or interacting with outsiders. And this generally leads to high fertility rates. So we sort of see two groups coming out the other end of this. One, this sort of group that's a shadow of, I think, everything good about humanity, a technophobic, xenophobic group, and then an alliance of pluralistic cultural groups who have experimented with ways to make themselves robust and get through this. And we're really kind of excited about this because in a way, while it means things will be worse for our kids and grandkids, they'll probably be much better for our great-grandkids. Anyway, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a question. I was curious what role you thought the problems with modern dating culture play into fertility collapse.
Well, fertility collapse is caused, one, by biological means. If you look at some studies right now, it looks like by 2060, 50% of men in developed countries are going to be infertile. We are looking at an over 50% fertility, in sperm motility and rate drop in the last 51 years. Imagine if people's arms had gotten 50% shorter in the last, 50 years. People would be freaking out. But when it's fertility, nobody cares. And then you have things like the TIDE studies, which is very real science. If you're looking at something like, wow, brain fart here, hormone disruptors. Somebody here's got to know the word I'm looking for. Endocrine disruptors. Yeah, so the TIDE studies did a great study on this. They looked at moms who were pregnant with male fetuses and had that word in their first trimester at high rates. When the kids were born, they had smaller anogenital distances, showing they hadn't fully gender differentiated. There was a recent study that did a 7-year follow-up and found that they were showing more female-like than male-like play behavior. So we are changing as a species, both in terms of our gender presentation and in terms of our fertility, and that's hitting fertility pretty hard. Then there's the economic problem. It used to be the more kids you had, the more money you made. That was more little hands for the factories. Adults couldn't fit their hands in all those machines, and then we got rid of child labor, God forbid. Now there's basically no point to kids. No, I'm joking. But on the farm, it's true. Historically, the more kids you had, the more money you had. Now the more kids you have, the less money you have. It doesn't really take anything other than that. This change really only happened in mass about 2 generations ago. And we as a society are just now adapting to it, where a lot of people are like, what, you mean? They're like, why would I have kids? And the arguments for having kids are they're like pets to a lot of people, right? I think this is one of the reasons why religions have done a good job of motivating people to have kids, is they create an external ideological motivation to have kids beyond kids will make you happy or kids are an accessory, which unfortunately is the way a lot of people relate to kids these days. And when you're relating to kids that way, there's just not a reason to have a lot of them. And I should be clear here, fertility collapse within a cultural group is not fixed by the people having 2 kids. It's not fixed by the people having 1 kid. It's fixed by the people having 5 or 6 kids. Within Gen X right now, there was a survey done recently that 45% plan to have no kids. That means that even if the other 50% plan to have, so it means that for the population to stay stable, the other 50% would have to have around 4 kids each or more. Very few people are doing that anymore. And you would need an average group to do that for fertility to stay stable. So if you're asking culturally, how much of this is a cultural problem? That's maybe 30% of the cultural problem, but you can't fix it at all without realizing the cultural problem, without realizing why we can't talk about it, why leftists have to screech like you're being racist or transphobic. I don't even know how this is transphobic. You're being transphobic by mentioning this. But that's the way it is, and it's sort of where we've come to as a society where they don't recognize this as a political cause that they see as normative, and therefore they just ban it, they just sort of label it as other, and all the little antigens, like the antigens market, oh, this is an invading body, kill it, get rid of it, and then it goes off. And I can understand, it causes some problematic issues for them when they realize that the default plan for them is importing people from Africa to support them. But any other questions? Yeah.
The Black Death's influence on population and the economy in Europe. It seems like the Renaissance happened right after that.
Yeah, I think there will be a Renaissance after the Dark Ages. So let's explain why we're going to have a Dark Ages. So we've got a lot of people who are interested in economics here. So you guys are probably broadly familiar with how debt works. Debt is a miraculous thing when everything is growing on average. If I'm in private equity, if I make a $10 investment and $8 of that is debt and $2 of that is equity, and that thing grows by just 20%, well, heck, I've doubled my money. If it shrinks by just 20%, well, I am flat broke. That's a big problem. Well, because the economy was growing on average, because populations were growing on average, and I should be clear here, populations have been growing exponentially. The productivity per worker in our society has been growing linearly for about the past 200 years, even though technology has been growing exponentially. But anyway, so if populations begin to collapse exponentially, unless AI saves us all somehow, it might, but I'm not crossing my fingers. If things begin to decline on average, if the economy begins to decline on average, because population, or at least economically productive populations are declining on average, we have a big problem because we haven't just leveraged our country. People look at the national level of this country and they go, wow, we have an awful lot of debt. But it's not just the national level, it's at the state, it's at the city, it's the land, it's the businesses, it's the human capital in terms of our college students. It's literally every layer of this giant Ponzi scheme. If this happens for just like 10 years and you get average economic decline, the entire state infrastructure we have set up globally will collapse. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be road warrior. It means when developing countries begin to collapse, they actually end up in economic situations that are much worse than developing countries when they're in similar economic situations. A great example of this is South Africa, which is a collapsing developing country. So if you want to see what the future of the United States is going to be like, I would look at places like South Africa, where you're likely going to have rolling blackouts, clustered populations that defend themselves, and sort of some sort of protection scheme that you're paying until we can enter the next Renaissance when we learn from the mistakes of the past and those who sort of succumb to indolence. One of the things we talk about in some of our writings is we call it the trial of the lotus eaters, is what society is going through right now. We were given everything, all the hedonism we could want. And the future is going to be made up of only the people who could resist that and still motivate continuation of their culture and reproduction, which it turns out is very few of us. Any questions? Yeah.
You touched on this already, but what percentage of this, and this seems like the controllable percentage, is due to agro, biological, pharma, and all of their chemicals and everything?
How is that controllable?
That's the part that seems to be a natural progression. Society always has done this, but we have the ability to control that part.
Well, I mean,
and what percentage is it is the question.
50%. I like theoretically we have an ability to control this stuff, but like realistically, they control our government. I just don't know. Like I'm all for realistic policy proposals and stuff like that. But fighting agriculture, like industrial agriculture in America, the left isn't going to do it, and the red is certainly not going to do it. They control red states. Like I hear what you're saying. I just mean realistically, and then preventing me from getting that stuff. Look, I've got my own chickens, and I've got like a little farm in my backyard, but still most of my calories are coming from stuff I'm getting at a grocery store. I just don't know realistic. And if you talk about things like microplastics, there was a study done on some obscure mountain in China that showed that the amount of microplastics up there was not that much less than in major cities. If you can't survive this by living on top of a mountain in China, I don't know where you're going to get away. I mean, maybe you have a plan. I don't.
That's the question, is what's the solution to this? And it's just the more important part.
Oh, technology.
It's going to happen no matter what, but here's something that we can hopefully take steps.
Well, so there's two broad parts of the pronatalist movement. We had our first convention this year in Austin. It was fantastic. I'm usually seen as leading the technophilic faction, so I'm going to say technology is the way that we solve this. Better IVF, better polygenic selection, artificial wombs.
Breed our way out of this one.
What?
We can't convince our societies to breed
Oh, no, 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 no. The pronatalist movement is not about getting fertility rates up. If we were on the Titanic, we're just trying to get the lifeboats ready for as many people who are willing to not call us racist for getting the lifeboats ready. There is no not hitting the iceberg at this point. If you look at the statistics, I remember I was talking with a reporter about this, and they go, well, I've talked to many demographers, and they say you can't predict this stuff in the future. And I go, there was literally a study of millennials saying 50% plan to have no kids. Every leading indicator. Look at the rates of religiosity. They are falling off a cliff in Gen Alpha. This is logarithmic at this point. What do you mean you can't predict? What's going to change this? I asked her, I go, what, do you think like one day it's going to become a fad? Like teen pregnancies are going to be the next hot thing. I'll tell you what, the young generation always surprises me. When I was a teen,
Get Taylor Swift to have kids.
when I was a teen, I was like a hardcore goth kid, and people used to always tell me, they go, oh, you think that you're a rebel now. But you will, kids in the next generation, they'll find a way to shock you. And I looked at them and I was so smug. I was like, yeah, right. Well, I never thought cutting off your dick would become a fad. Sorry, I probably shouldn't be saying that one on camera. And I don't mean that, I believe that the trans movement is a real movement. I think that there's a sub-faction of it that has hijacked parts of it, and I think it's really tragic. I actually think what's happened to the LGBT movement is particularly tragic because the urban monoculture has sort of used it as their flag. When they defeat a synagogue, when they defeat a mosque, they hang this flag out in front of it. Now, if you go to the 80s, the vast majority of LGBT people were gay men, okay? 45% of gay men, the portion of the LGBT community that fought for all these rights, voted for Trump in the last election cycle. And yet they are using their flag to say, hey, it's like bull baiting, you know? It's disgusting. Anyway, so I don't want to come off as transphobic, even though that was a horrible joke from that perspective. Anyway, sorry. Yes?
So, you gave us a lot. So I'm wondering if you talked about how, like, today, kids are accessories. They're not seen as economic assets. But at the same time, if you're wealthy enough, you can have as many kids as you want. So I'm just wondering, is the solution for those of us who are technically economically competent, like, make ourselves more secure so we can economically save have more kids and like build these safer enclaves, build our free states, whatever. So like when the urban progressive state collapses, like there's enough of us. Like is this are we gonna have a limit? Like what? Can you? Are you guys
Generally within a country and between countries, the less money you have, the more kids you're going to have. So when people are like, I can't afford kids, I'm like, well, I'm looking at a graph here, and it's a direct correlation between how little money you have and how many kids you have. Now, I should note that there is actually a U-curve at the far end of this where it begins to go up again, and you get above repopulation rate again when an average family is earning over $500,000 a year. And I'm like, that's not sustainable to do as government handouts, okay? Yeah, you can't, like, I wouldn't even focus on the economics. The question is, when somebody says, I can't afford to have kids, what they often mean is, I cannot afford to keep living my current lifestyle and have kids. That's what I can't afford to have kids means. There are lots of people in this country with a lot less money than you that are doing better jobs as parents than you or I could do. And I don't mean like you specifically, I'm just saying like generally speaking, the problem isn't wealth, it's lifestyle expectations. Now, the problem is in government. So let's talk about this for a second. Yeah, so if you are like middle income and you have kids and you aren't raising them by the government standards, we've had CPS called on our family. You know why they were called on our family? Because our kids were wearing used clothes. Oh my God. Our kids played outside without supervision. We were watching from the windows and it's a gated yard, but okay, this is horrifying. And our kids got sick frequently. This is when we still had them in daycare before we decided that was too expensive. Scam. I'm like, these laws were made by somebody who definitely doesn't have over 2 kids. Or they would realize how insane these laws are. So there is a problem in which a lot of people within our society, like our economic peer group, expects a form of parenting from us that is completely unrealistic at a middle income level. When you hear things about like a woman being arrested by CPS because she had her 12-year-old kid watch her 8-year-old kid, like what? That's what 12-year-olds are for. I can't send them to a factory. At the very least, I can have them watch my other kid. So in a great piece by a friend of mine, Zvi Malkowitz, called Car Seats as Contraception, I suggest you guys read, I think probably like the key libertarian pronatalist piece, which goes over all the little regulations. Did you know it's something like until the age of 12 in a lot of states that you can't stop using car seats? How are you supposed to have more than like 6 kids if you can't stop using car seats until the age of 12? And that's barely any kids. You know, we're going for like 17. I need a pickup truck full of kids. And no one's letting me put my kids in a pickup truck anymore. Anyway, sorry, I don't know if that is.
Yeah. I do think you're on to something there. Brian Kaplan's here this weekend. His book, I think, really lays this out, that parents think that parenting needs to be way more intensive than it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the surveys, I think, are showing this around the world, that there's been this spike in expectations about like how much time you need to spend with your kids and things like that are completely unrealistic, and maybe that's...
Yeah, oh no, and parenting now is easier than it's ever been, as long as you're actually looking at the research. So parents come to me and they go, do you know how bad screens are for kids? I was like, no, I don't know. I guess I'll look up. So I looked up how bad screens are. They're like 5% worse. A kid who has a heavy exposure to like iPads, 5% worse. Do you know how much easier it is to raise a kid when you stick an iPad in front of them? It's dramatically easier than 5% easier. If I can double the number of kids I have by sticking a pad in front of a few of them every now and then, yeah, I'm gonna do that. And I think that this is the problem, where we have this expectation as a culture where anything that lowers the quality of life of a kid is absolute no-go, but they don't consider kids. Like when we're making economic calculations as a society and we're deciding, are we gonna put bumpers on this road because if somebody starts swerving, they're gonna crash, and they need to value a human life at something when they're making those calculations, they do it, something like $1 million or something like that. Now, when we are thinking about the kids who aren't born because of regulations, whether it's car seat regulations or regulations like the CPS regulations, we don't factor them in. We don't assign any monetary value to the lives of the kids who people chose not to have. We don't weigh those kids over the kids who die, who are in a car crash or something. I mean, it's horrible, but what I'm just saying is we have a very perverse way of looking at life in this country. It's an all or nothing thing instead of a spectrum of potentiality, which is, I think, the way that we should actually be looking at life if we want to solve this fertility crisis. And yeah, Brian Kaplan left his stuff. Oh yeah, I should also mention, we have a daily podcast, my wife and I, Base Camp. She's not here right now because she's running for office right now in Pennsylvania for the State House. Very excited. Maybe we can take this country in a better direction. And you can check out our podcast Base Camp on like Substack or YouTube or anywhere. And we talk about sex, politics, and religion, and a lot about pronatalism, but not like that much. It's mostly about just things that, as we say, will piss off the new left and the old right. Yeah.
Has anybody started studying the effects of the COVID vaccine on fertility?
Yes, and I have secret access to that information. There is a fantastic researcher who's done a really big study on this in the UK. It's about 14%. The mechanism of action seems to be some sort of, I forget the word, some sort of coagulant, or some sort of like blob of something blocks the fallopian tubes and prevents the eggs from properly releasing. So it is happening, yes.
When you say 14%, do you mean 14% decline?
So populations that were vaccinated versus populations that weren't vaccinated have a 14% harder time getting pregnant. So it's not, I mean, it's pretty big, but it's not like ginormous. It doesn't explain everything. Sorry, you had your hand up first and then I'll get to you.
Yeah, so what do you think the increased prevalence of internet pornography has on impacts?
None. No, really none. So I wrote a book, The Pragmatist's Guide to Sexuality. It's one of our books. I really love it. I've done a lot of research on this space. Masturbation was one of the things that surprised me most because my intuitions around it were super wrong. One of the things that really shocked me is the higher the prohibitions a culture has against pornography, the higher rate it consumes pornography. So there was a great study of this in Utah that looked at how heavily Mormon a zip code was and then correlated that with how much pornography was consumed within that zip code. And it was a direct correlation. And so it turns out that porn does have some negative effects if you believe porn has negative effects, like if you feel guilt over it. If you don't, there hasn't been, now people will talk about I know there's groups that are like pornography addiction, blah, blah, blah. It just hasn't been robustly. Me, as a skeptical person who wanted to write a piece about how actually porn is bad, when I looked at the data, and I hate modern academia, I hate everything like that, it doesn't seem to be a major factor at play here. And keep in mind that countries with ultra low fertility rates like Korea ban pornography. When I was living in Korea, I couldn't use pornography. I could be arrested. In many of these ultra low fertility rate countries, pornography is already banned and it's not helping. So you had a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering about abortion and I'm wondering about adoption agencies. I have no idea.
Yeah, so.
Children are up for adoption here or anywhere else, and how has the abortion rate affected them?
So abortion doesn't really seem to matter for fertility rates, really interestingly. So I want to say it was Hungary was order 6 something something something, banned this in the 1980s when they were still communist, and it caused a sharp spike in fertility rates and a quick collapse because it ended up creating the perception that having kids with a low class or like low self-control thing to do. We can look in Europe right now, and I have this one map that I actually recently released in an Aporia piece, which correlated the fertility rate in European countries by how strict abortion access was within those countries. And it's like direct. The stricter a country is in terms of abortion access, the lower their fertility rate's going to be. It's likely due to the same thing we were talking about, where like the more conservative on average a society is, the lower its fertility rate is. Now, that's not because of abortion or anything like that. It's just banning abortion is no silver bullet with fertility rate, unfortunately. It would be cool if it was, I guess, but it's just not. I'm not ethically super chill with it, but it's not a solution, unfortunately. In terms of adoption rates, this is really interesting because the pronatalists, like I'm here talking about the urban monoculture. I don't know if you guys know the antinatalists or the ethalists, but there are these people out there that want all humans dead. And it's actually a big and growing movement. And it makes a lot of sense. People need to justify why they're making the economic and lifestyle choices they're making. And then a lot easier than thinking I'm a bad person is thinking, oh, the people having kids and wholesome families must be bad people. And this movement is always trashing on us. No one in the antinatalist movement has ever adopted a kid. If you look at like the pronatalist convention and stuff like that, like a huge number of people have adopted kids. So it's a weird thing that often people who have a lot of biological children also adopt children. And my wife and I, after we stopped being able to have kids biologically, yeah, we'll probably adopt. I don't want to stop. It's awesome. Like once you get into the routine of being a parent, I don't know why I'd do anything else. Yeah.
Unrealistic partner and lifestyle.
Oh, that's a huge problem. Mating markets are basically screwed. So one of our books, The Pragmatist Guide to Relationships, we were studying marriage markets. And when people say how bad, like on what scale do you think marriage markets are screwed? I'm like, I am already in talks with other parents about arranged marriages for my kids. Like, that's how bad. You want to know how bad marriage markets are? When I say this to people in my generation, they look at me with horror. When I say this to Gen Alpha people, they're like, can you get my parents into this? Because dating culture right now, and we could go into like the book is basically a huge analysis as to why it's so bad. A huge part of it is low switching costs. It used to be that there was a really high cost to looking for new partners. And when you have very low switching costs within relationships, there's gonna be a constant expectation that new relationships will be higher value to you than your existing relationship, which causes you to undervalue your existing relationship and be more likely to break up. Anyway, please take my books, by the way, for people who are leaving. I want to get rid of them. Yeah?
I'm curious about the effects of electromagnetic frequency, 5G.
No idea.
Chemtrails on that stuff.
I just don't know. I don't know. I haven't looked at it. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Gen X here.
Yeah.
I was born in 1969. The world's population was half what it is now. I'm not arguing with you, but if the world's population were to, say, slide back to, say, 6 or 4 billion, things worked fairly well in 1969.
Yeah, it would be fine if we hadn't taken out all this debt. No, you're right. Like, it shouldn't be a problem. Unfortunately, we built our entire and when people say you mean Western civilization, no, I mean China, I mean Japan, everything's built on debt. The entire foundation of the global economic ecosystem was built on the assumption of average growth every year. If that stops, we're going towards a dark age.
The Bible talks about jubilees all the time.
Yeah, well,
A jubilee being a debt forgiveness. I mean, that's in the Bible, right?
wow, it'd be great if a lot of our economic players in the world still followed one of the Abrahamic faiths. I'll go to them. I'll tell them. No, don't worry. I'll go to Chase.
I'm just saying, we've had debt
Yeah.
forgiveness within society, but that's a solvable problem.
Yeah, it might be a solvable problem. It'd be cool if it turns out to be solvable.
It's solvable when the USSR collapsed.
Yeah, it might turn out to be a nothing burger.
We're changing the schedule due to a late lunch. If you can stay until 2:30, that would be great.
Oh, I can keep talking forever. I got whole other subjects to go over here. Yeah. Okay, so I got 2 questions here, and then I can keep going with a speech. Oh, sorry, I'll try to slow down a little bit. I'm so sorry. I'm very excitable. You and then you. Yeah.
So, no correlation doesn't mean causation, but from what you just said, it sounds like fertility is in inverse proportion to the debt load of a country.
Is in inverse proportion to the debt load of a country.
The more debt a country takes on, the lower its fertility rate.
You know, that might actually be true now that I think about it. Like Japan has a really high amount of debt. I haven't looked into it and I don't understand what the mechanism of action might be, but I bet you could find a correlation if you charted that.
If I had to pause it or just wag a,
Yeah.
there might be correlations because really it's the lower middle class and middle class and upper middle class that's going to take the burden of the tax roll onto their shoulders.
Mhm.
It's going to make it economically more difficult and more difficult to
Yeah.
justify having additional children, which would push the birth rates to the lower end where they just don't care. Why not?
Yeah.
The upper end where cost is not an object.
Yeah. Well, okay, actually, before I get to more questions, because I have a bit of time here, I'm going to go on another rant. But this is a really interesting rant for this audience. So it's on, I want to do a case study of what collapse looks like so that you can understand that I'm not just talking in generalities. So we're going to use Manhattan here, okay? And Manhattan is great for sort of predicting where the future of the US and global economy is going to go. So right now in Manhattan, somebody might be hearing what I'm saying and they're like, look, Manhattan has a huge and robust tax base right now. And I'm like, actually, you might not know this. I think it was it was over 50% of Manhattan's tax base is paid by 4% of its population. So no, it really doesn't. If they lose that 4%, and this is a big problem because as a city becomes more progressive, i.e. progressive in their tax policy, and a progressive tax policy, for those who don't know, is one that overburdens the ultra wealthy. Its core customers become the ultra wealthy. If you're thinking about a city like a business, the more it pushes the percentage of taxes being paid to the ultra wealthy, the more it needs to cater to the political needs and economic needs of the ultra wealthy to prevent them from leaving. Well, this creates a secondary problem in a place like Manhattan when this debt issue is at play. Because let's not talk about national debt or anything like that. People look at Manhattan's debt right now and they go, oh, don't worry. Right now, Manhattan's debt on the books is only 7% of the state's budget, city's budget per year. And I'm like, well, they've kind of hidden something from you. If you look at the payroll, around a third of the payroll goes to unfunded pension programs and programs like that. That is debt, just debt they've taken against their own citizens, i.e. they didn't fund the fire department's pension, they didn't fund the police department's pension. Yes. So this leads to a situation where you're probably looking closer to something like 42% of Manhattan's budget is going to debt. Well, this creates a big problem if they lose something like, say, 20% of their tax base. Because that's not like losing 20% of the money you have to spend. That's like losing 35% of the money you have to spend, which is huge. This is ultimately what ended up causing the collapse of Detroit, but Detroit had a world to bail it out when this happened. It wasn't happening to a bunch of cities at once. When Detroit collapsed, it had a massive population exodus, around 60%, obviously a business exodus, there were some other things combined with this, over a short period of time, and it collapsed at the point. So you're wondering, what was the breaking point for Detroit? When 50% of the money coming in was going to past expenses. And this is a major problem in population collapse, not just from the level of debt, but also from the level of things like, when you're talking about a pension, when a city is half the size, it doesn't cost half the amount to run your sewer system. It doesn't cost half the amount to pay the pensions on your old fire and police departments, which can lead things to break down at a really aggressive rate. I actually want to talk about another theory here, which is something I've written a lot about, which is a little off, and this is going to be in our governance book, but it comes back to the city, which comes to the point of why are command economies so bad? And basically, we argue that if you study it like you're studying an animal, so study it from a biological perspective. When you look at things that live a really long time or are really large, like turtles or whales that have tons of cells, they have unique biological mechanisms in them that are like cranked up hardcore for fighting cancer, because cancer is a very big problem in this. The problem is we also get cancers within governing institutions. The larger a governing body is, or the longer lived a governing body is, the higher the probability a simple self-replicating segment of that will just begin to self-replicate and ask for more money. I'll give an example here. Suppose in 1 year we create 10 departments in Manhattan which are meant to keep the streets from getting potholes in them. And one of these departments, just through like random mutation, like in evolution or like in the body, it decides that it's not actually about reducing potholes, it's about bringing awareness to potholes. Well, now this is a job that's never quite finished. And it's a job that intrinsically draws more attention to it as it gets more money. It always needs more money to bring more attention to this department, right? Now, naturally in a body, a number of these sort of mutant cancer-like cells will be deleted. But some of them get really good at defending themselves. They'll create something like, well, if you delete me, then you're a racist. So you can't delete me, right? And these sorts of defenses work really, really well for these simple self-replicating bodies. Within capitalism, the reason why capitalism works so well is when an organization gets really big or lives a really long time and begins to develop a lot of these, it just gets less and less efficient. There is no way somebody like me should be able to create a product that competes with an organization like Google, except that Google is so inefficient now because it's so large and so big. And like a leviathan covered in tumorous growth, it will eventually collapse under its own weight, wheezing. The problem comes with governments, because governments, as everyone here likely knows, have a monopoly on violence within a state, right? And so they can't be outcompeted by other institutions. And so the cancers that grow within them only get worse until they become more and more and more inefficient. And this becomes uniquely a big deal. So when people are like, yeah, but functionally, why does this matter to me? Well, it matters to you because you live in a country that in a large part is powered by nuclear power. And almost all of our nuclear plants were created over 50 years ago, and they are now too expensive from a bureaucratic perspective to build a new one. And they're entering the end of their life cycles. So as they begin to shut down, we don't really have other solutions in line within our current bureaucracy. When people mention something like, oh, the Golden Gate Bridge took this much money to build and it costs more just to put up the suicide nets, like this is an existential problem. This isn't like a joke about government bureaucracy, because it's a cumulative problem that we have no way to reverse. Well, anyway, so that's a secondary rant that I wanted to get into that I thought would be fun for this and is in one of my books. Anyway, go questions so I can go into stuff. Yeah. I think you were the last one.
Japan is currently experiencing a fertility crisis, but I'm wondering if you've taken a look at like calorie output, the available natural arable land under normal conditions, and also energy availability. Because it seems to me that perhaps Japan is just returning to the natural carrying capacity of that rather rocky, resource-free island.
Maybe. I haven't.
There were a number of questions on causes, biological causes of possible fertility, like chemicals in food and chemicals So really, do all the other biological issues matter that much?
I'm going to be honest. Like, I don't focus on the other biological issues because I don't think they matter that much. I mean, even if they weren't an issue, 50% of millennials don't want kids. Like, why does it matter? It does. So they matter for specific groups, right? So when I'm talking about to groups that believe that life begins at conception and therefore won't use IVF, the fact that 50% of men in the developed world are going to be infertile by 2060, that starts to matter then. But it doesn't matter if you're talking about like global trends. Yeah.
When I think about pronatal culture and what it looks like, I think of high status parenthood and a consistent messaging that children are a blessing. And so high status parenthood means holding people in high regard for their parentage and being critical of people who are not having children, and then being consistent about messaging means, for example, not opposing teen pregnancy. Right? So this is the core.
Yeah, no, you're right. We need to bring teen pregnancy back. No, I'm joking a little bit, but I would not be disappointed if my kids had kids when they were young and they gave those kids to me to help raise. Because I think that realistically, that's what we used to do as a country. I don't know if people knew this, but in the 1970s, the average age of the first pregnancy in the United States, average, 21. That means a lot of them were having births, half of them were having births before 21. Okay, that's a serious thing. So no, I agree with you, and I also think that this matters a lot. We talk a lot to like red pillars and stuff like that. Like they watch our channel a lot, and we're always telling them, if you do not glorify the women in your life who take on the burden of motherhood, and you do not treat them appropriately, you might be like, oh, I've got a great wife at home, but your daughters won't want to become mothers. Gender relations are really important here, and gender relations where both partners feel respect, but not just feel respect, look respect through the eyes of their kids. Because the way you treat your wife or your husband, that's a sales pitch to your sons and daughters as to why they should get married. Thank you.